school was like an alley, and I was in like 3rd grade, and there was this chick I had a crush on, and we were walking back there, and then I held her hand, and then she kept holding my hand, and then we walked to right before you walk out the alley, and she turned and gave me a kiss on my lips, and I let go of my hand and ran into like fucking recess, and I was like, yo.
Hello, how are you? I'm pretty good.
talk about 9 different ways that you can make passive income. And for each of those, I'm going to talk about how hard it is to get started, how hard it is to make $100 a month from it, and how hard it is to maintain once you've created the thing in the first place. For me and my business, these 9 different sources generate around $27,000 per week these days with varying degrees of passiveness. And obviously this has taken me like 8 years to build up, so don't expect to be hitting those sorts of numbers when you first get started. But this is the video that I wish I would have had when I started my financial independence journey many years ago. Let's go for it. All right, so when I say passive income, I always air quote it because there is really no such thing as passive income. There is no way to make money without doing anything at all. But when I say passive income, what I mean is that it's money that is not directly tied to our time. So let's say you were to write a book. If you write a book, you publish a book, that book is now on bookshelves. You've done the work kind of once to write and publish the book, but now anytime the book sells, you make money from royalties. That is passive income. You could literally be making money while you sleep because you've created this thing which is out in the world, which is generating income for you. The other thing with passive income is that it always takes a very long time to get going. So if you see any ads before this video talking about get rich quick by whatever scheme, or if you see people in the comments pretending to be me saying, oh my God, here's how you can get rich quick with crypto, WhatsApp this number, that is all a scam. It's not gonna work. There is no way to get rich quick. It is not a thing. So if you're looking for a get rich quick scheme, those things just don't exist. So you might as well not even try. And the way I think of this is that ultimately money is just a medium for exchanging value. The only way to make money is to provide value. And the only way to make passive income, passive money, is to provide value in a way that is not directly tied to your time. So please do not try and join a get rich quick scheme. They don't exist. I've had lots of messages over the years from people who have tried signing up to a get rich quick crypto scheme or a gambling scheme or a, hey, here is how you kind of play poker online. None of these things ever work. People always end up losing money. The only way to make money is by providing value. And so let's talk about the 9 different ways that you could provide value if you wanted to. Just before we dive in, I want to tell you that I've just launched my brand new Skillshare class about productivity for creators, how to start a successful side hustle. That's linked in the video description. Skillshare is sponsoring this video. I'll tell you more about Skillshare later on, but I want to plug my own class because I think it's genuinely really good and people really like it, and it will help you get tips on how you can start side hustles in your spare time. Anyway, let's get into the video. All right, so let's kick things off with investing in stocks and shares. And in this context, the way that we provide value is by offering up our money. Providing money and investing in a service is, in a way, giving a form of value. And so when we give our money to a company in the form of buying their stocks, it makes sense that we would get some kind of return for that investment. And we're starting with this because investing in stocks is the easiest way to make any kind of passive income. If you have any sorts of savings and they're sitting in a savings account earning 0.01% interest, they're not really doing very much for you. Whereas if you had those savings and put them in stocks, you could potentially be earning passive income from the money that's otherwise just sitting there. Now, I've got a whole video called The Ultimate Guide to Investing in Stocks and Shares for Beginners, which is going to be linked over there somewhere. So that is a solid half-an-hour long introduction to stocks and exactly how they work. But the thing that I recommend for most beginners as a non-financial advisor, and this is not financial advice, purely for entertainment purposes only, or so people say, or at least the thing that I do is that basically all my money that's in stocks and shares is invested in index funds. Now, an index fund is something like the S&P 500. And when you invest, let's say $1,000 in the S&P 500, that basically means that your $1,000 is distributed amongst the top 500 biggest companies in the US. So, you know, weighted by how big they are. So like, 2% of it would be in Apple, 2% in Facebook, 2% in Google, 2% in Microsoft. And then you probably won't have heard of the 500th company on the list, but basically all the big US companies you've heard of, you end up investing in all of them a little bit at a time. So if you want to get started with that, all you need to do is sign up to a stockbroker. If you're in the US, you can use Webull, I think. I've got a link in the description. If you're in the UK, you can use Freetrade or Vanguard. Basically, whatever country you're in, just Google the phrase best stockbroker platform, your country name, and you'll find something that works for you, and then it's very easy to be able to invest in an index fund. So within our famous side hustle assessment matrix, we're going to give the difficulty of starting a 1-star rating, 1 out of 5. It's very easy to get started with stocks. How hard is it to make $100 a month by investing in stocks and shares? Well, this kind of depends because it depends on the performance of the stock market overall. So in the last 12 months, from 2020 to 2021, the S&P 500 has actually increased by about 50%. That is a lot. It's like gone up by a solid 50% despite COVID and everything going on. So if in April 2020 you had invested $2,400 in the S&P 500, the fact that it's gone up by 50% means you would have made $100 a month. But obviously this is not the way to look at it because, things can go up and down, and the stock market has different levels of performance depending on what time period you're looking at. But if we average out the last 30 to 50 years, the S&P 500 has had a roughly 10-point-something% return, which means every year, on average, over the long term, it goes up by around 10%. This is not inflation adjusted for any economist among us. And so if we do some back of the envelope calculations, if we want to earn $100 a month passively through stocks and shares, we would need around about $12,000 invested in the S&P 500 to make that 10%, $1,200 a year, which is $100 a month. But as I talk about in that video about stocks, over time we have compounding. And so if you put in $7,500 in the S&P 500 and you left it there for 5 years, then 5 years later, you would be making roughly $100 a month if we go by this very average figure of 10% a year. Or if you invested $5,000 in the S&P 500, then 10 years later, you'd be making $100 a month in purely passive income, again, assuming the 10% average. So overall, how hard is it really to make $100 a month in passive income from stocks and shares? Well, it kind of just depends on how hard is it for you to make $5,000, $7,500, or $12,000 in savings and put them into a stock market index fund. And crucially, this is money that you shouldn't need to touch in the next 5 to 10 years at least. So basically, how easy is it for you to make that sort of money? Obviously varies massively depending on which country you're in and what your circumstances are and what your job is. But if you're in the UK or the US, where the median kind of average salary is around about $50,000, something like that, then again, depending on your circumstances, it's not that hard to get $10,000 in savings. Obviously, if you're supporting a family of 15 people on $50,000, it's different. If you're a single person, again, it's different. But I'm going to give this roughly a 3 out of 5 star rating for difficulty of getting $100 a month. Obviously, if you live in a country like India, where the average salary is $3,600 a year, it's very, very difficult to make $10,000 in savings overall. And finally, the third category in our side hustle assessment matrix is how hard is it to maintain this income once you've set it up in the first place? And we're going to give this a 1 star out of 5 because once you've got the money in, you just...
If you can't find a way to make money while you sleep, you will have to work till you die.
Right, so let's say you want to get started with this investing thing. You might have a bit of money saved. It's probably not enough for a house, but you reckon I should probably invest this in something. Maybe you've heard on the news about Tesla or Netflix or Amazon and how if you'd invested 10 years ago in Tesla, then you'd be a billionaire by now, or things like that. But if you're new to the game, this whole investment thing can seem like a really complicated black box. Like, how do you even buy a stock? What even is a stock? Do you just go on Tesla.com and buy some Tesla? Like, how does it work? And if you try and look into this, you get all these acronyms being thrown around, like Roth IRAs and 401ks in America, or like ISAs and LISAs in the UK. And on top of that, there is the anxiety that we all have that I know investing is risky and I don't want to lose all of my money. So in light of all of that, this is the ultimate guide on how to get started with investing. It is the video I wish I would have had 5 years ago when I first started investing in stocks and shares. And we're going to cover this by thinking about investing in 10 different bite-sized steps. So the first one is forgetting about investing completely and just thinking, what happens to my money over time by default? And if you've studied economics, you will know that your money loses its value over time thanks to something called inflation. Inflation is generally around about the 2%, 2.5% mark, and so that means that every year stuff costs about 2% more than it did the year before. For example, in 1970 in America, a cup of coffee cost 25 cents, but in 2019 that same cup of coffee cost $1.59. That is inflation in action. And so let's say you've got £1,000 in your hand right now, and for the next 10 years, you just stash it under your mattress and you never look at it again. In 10 years' time, your £1,000 is not going to be worth £1,000 anymore because everything will have increased by 2%-ish every year. So the value of your money will have fallen. And so if you put your £1,000 under your mattress for 10 years, you will lose money over time, and this is obviously not good. Even if you put your money in a savings account, like these days, a savings account will give you like 0.2% interest, which means your money goes up by 0.2% every year. But because inflation is up by 2%, you're still losing money over time. And again, this is not good. Okay, so that begs the question, which is key point number 2, which is how do we stop our money from losing value over time? And the answer is that if we had a hypothetical savings account, one that was, let's say, an interest rate of 2.5%, that would match roughly the rate of inflation. So inflation means everything goes up by 2.5% in terms of price, but our money in our savings account also goes up by 2.5% each year. Therefore, we're technically not losing money over time. If you're watching this and you have an issue with the word interest, then don't worry, stick to it for now. Investment is not the same as interest, but we'll come back to that a bit later. But the point here is that we don't just want to not lose money, which is what happens at our 2.5% rate. We actually want to make money. And that brings us on to question number 3, which is, well, how do we actually make money? Now, let's go back to our hypothetical savings account. If, hypothetically, we could have a savings account that was giving us a 10% interest rate, this would never happen because that's just way too high. But hypothetically, if it did, that means that every year we'd be making 10% of the value of the money in our savings account. So for example, if I were to put £100 in a savings account right now, then next year it would be worth 110. And then the year after it'll be 121 because it's 10% of then the 110. And then it would be 130 something. And this would very quickly compound so that in 10 years time, my £100 will have become £259. And if we adjust for inflation, then our money is still worth £206 in 10 years' time. This is pretty good. We have more than doubled our money by just putting it in this hypothetical 10% interest savings account. And it really doesn't seem like it would do that because 10% feels like a small amount of money. But if you extrapolate 10% over 10 years, you actually double your money, which is pretty awesome. Sadly, these hypothetical 10% saving accounts don't really exist because it's just way too high and real life is not that nice. These days, most savings accounts in the UK, and I imagine around the rest of the world as well, offer less than a 1% savings rate, which means you're actually still losing money over time. But we do have other options to try and get us to this magical nirvana of like, this 10% savings thingy. And that is where investments come in. So point number 4 is, what is an investment? And the answer is that an investment is something that puts money in your pocket. For example, let's say you buy a house for £100,000 and you want to rent it out to people. There are 2 ways that's an investment. There are 2 ways you're making money from it. Firstly, let's say you're charging some rent to the people living in your house. Let's say you're charging them £830 a month. That becomes £10,000 a year. And so every year you are making £10,000 in rental income, which is 10% of what you originally paid for the house. That means that in 10 years' time, you'll have paid off the £100,000 that you put in because you're making 10K a year. And beyond that, every year, you're just making £10,000 in pure profit. So that's pretty good. But secondly, it's an investment because the value of the house itself would probably rise over time. In general, there is a trend in most developed countries that house prices tend to rise over the long term. And so your house will probably be worth more than £100,000 in 10 years' time. And in fact, in the UK, historically, in the past, some people have said that house prices have doubled every 10 years. So maybe your house is worth close to £200,000. And so you made money off of the rental income, but you've also made money off of the capital gains, which is what we call it when an asset increases in value over time. But the problem is that buying a house is a little bit annoying. You need to have quite a large amount of money for a deposit. You need to get a mortgage. You need to actually have the house. You need to sort out the rental management, rent it out to people, all of that kind of stuff. If only there were a way of investing without A, having a large amount of money to start with, and B, without having to put that much effort into managing the asset as well. And that brings us on to investing in shares. And for me, basically 100% of my investment portfolio is entirely shares. I have a tiny percentage in Bitcoin and I own this house, but I don't consider this house an investment. I'll talk about that in a different video. Therefore, point number 5 is, what are shares and how do they work? So buying shares is probably as close as we're ever going to get to this magical savings account that just returns some amount of money each year. And the idea is that when you buy a share, you are buying a part ownership of the company that you've got the share in. For example, let's say that Apple have a particularly profitable year because lots of people have bought iPads as per my recommendations, and because Apple are feeling kind, they are choosing to pay out a dividend to their shareholders. So for example, they might say that they're going to issue a dividend of £1 million, and that's going to be split evenly amongst whoever owns shares in Apple based on how many shares they own. So for example, if you happen to own 1% of Apple, you would get 1% of that dividend that they've issued. So 1% of £1 million, which is £10,000. Obviously, no one watching this actually owns 1% of Apple, unless Tim Cook you're watching. I don't even know if you own that much, because that would make you an extremely rich person because Apple is a very valuable company. But that's basically how the dividend thing works. A company decides to issue a dividend as a way of returning some of its profit back to the people who have invested in the company, and therefore you make money through dividends. The second way of making money from shares is sort of like with houses in that you get the capital gains over time. So for example, let's say you bought 10 shares in Apple in 2010. At the time, those shares were selling for $9 each, so you spent $90 on buying 10 shares in Apple. As of October 2020, Apple shares sell for $115, so your 10 shares are now worth $1,150, despite the fact that you only paid $90 for them 10 years ago. Okay, so we've talked about what a share is and how you make money from them, and at this point, you've probably got a few questions like how much money you need to get started or how risky is buying shares in a company, and I promise we're going to get to that. But point number 6 is, how the hell do you buy a share in the first place? And this is where it can kind of get complicated because it's not as simple as going on apple.com/buy and just buying a share in Apple. It doesn't quite work like that. Instead, you have to go through what's called a broker. And back in the day, a stockbroker was a physical person, usually a dude, who you would call on the phone and say, hey, Bob, I want to place an order for some shares in Apple. And then Bob would type some stuff into his computer or place like a paper order, and then you would own shares in Apple. Thankfully, these days, we don't really have to talk to Bob because there's loads and loads of online brokers instead. And so you make an account on an online broker and then you can buy shares in a company through that. A bit annoyingly, every different country has their own different brokers that operate in that country because to be an online broker in a country, you have to abide by like a zillion different laws. And so in the UK, the system is different to the US, which is different to Canada and Germany and so on. In the UK, for example, most banks do have their own online brokery type thing. So with most bank accounts, you can also open an investment account with them and then invest online. But usually the interface is a bit clunky, it's a bit old fashioned. And so you're usually better off going with an online broker. In the UK, the two that I use are Charles Stanley Direct and Vanguard. But before we get ahead of ourselves and make an account on Vanguard or whatever, we need to understand a few more things. And so question number 7 is, how the hell do I decide which shares to buy? And the easy answer to that is that you actually don't want to figure out which shares to buy. You do not want to buy individual shares. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that once I've had a haircut, so see you shortly. All right, so new hair. I've got my Invisalign braces on, so I'm going to sound a little bit different, but where were we? Oh yeah, we were talking about why it's not a good idea, generally speaking, to invest in individual stocks. And I'm going to do a video about this some other time, but essentially the issue with investing in individual stocks is it's kind of risky. Like, yes, if you invest in something like Apple, chances are it's going to be around 10 years from now. But historically, there have been quite a few companies that people were like, oh my God, this is amazing, this is the thing to invest in. And then that company went bust. So you're automatically exposing yourself to more risk if you are investing in individual stocks. Also, in general, like, it's easy to say, hey, Amazon grew 10x in the last 10 years, therefore it's going to continue to do the same for the next 10 years. But that's trying to predict the future, and the past is no real indication of future performance. And so the advice that most people would give for beginners is that you should not invest in individual stocks, you should invest in index funds. And this is what Graham Stephan, one of my favorite YouTubers, also says as well. He says that index funds are the best, safest, and easiest long-term investment strategy for most people, which begs the question, point number 8, what the hell is an index fund? So there's basically two bits to understand here. There's the index bit and the fund bit. Let's start with the fund bit. And a fund is basically where investors will pool their money. So multiple investors would invest in the same fund. And then that fund would have a fund manager. And the fund manager decides which companies the fund is going to invest in. For example, let's say I were managing a fund and I called it Gringotts, and let's say 100 people from my audience decided to invest in my Gringotts fund. I, as the fund manager, can say, okay, the Gringotts fund, now that we have 100 people's money, let's say is 100 million, so everyone's invested 1 million each, I've now got 100 million. I'm going to put 20% of that in Apple, 10% in Facebook, 10% in Amazon, 10% in Tesla, 10% in Netflix, 10% in Johnson & Johnson, all of that sort of stuff. And so you, the investor, don't have to worry about this because you trust me and my fund Gringotts to manage your money. And as you know, the fund performs well because the prices of these stocks and shares increases, you get the returns and I take a 1 or 2% management fee. So I make a load of money because I'm earning 1 or 2% off of this 100 million that I'm managing, and you're not worrying about having to pick stocks yourself. You trust me as a seasoned professional to do that for you. So that's what a fund is. Now, the index bit refers to a stock market index. And so a stock market index would, for example, be the FTSE 100, which is the 100 biggest companies in the UK, or the S&P 500, which is the 500 biggest companies in the US, or the NASDAQ, or the Dow. And these are all different indices of the stock market. And if we use the S&P 500, for example, these are the components of the S&P 500. So we said it's the 500 biggest companies in the US. So number 1 is Apple, and Apple makes up 6.5% of the S&P. Microsoft makes up 5.5, Amazon makes up 4.7, Facebook is 2.2, Alphabet, which is Google, makes 1.5 and 1.5, so about 3% of the total S&P 500. And essentially, we've got these 500 companies. If you go all the way down, oh, Ralph Lauren is 496, but chances are you've not really heard of many of the other ones at the bottom of the list. But chances are you've heard of most of the companies towards the top of the list. So the S&P 500 is an index of the US stock market. And if you look at the performance as a whole of the S&P 500, you get a general idea of how the US economy is going as a whole. So this is currently what the S&P 500 looks like. And if we do a 5-year time horizon, in fact, let's go maths. So you can see, the S&P 500 started in 1980. And since that time, this is what the US stock market has been doing. So, as you can see, there is a general trend upwards. But for example, in 2000, there was a bit of a crash. In 2008, famously, there was a bit of a crash. And earlier this year, when Corona was first starting to be a thing, there was a bit of a crash. But then the market basically immediately recovered after that. Okay, so we know what a fund is, i.e. a way of pooling money, and we know what an index is, like something like the S&P 500. When you combine those, you get an index fund, which is a fund that automatically invests in all of the companies in the index. And so with me, for example, basically all of my investments, all of my money is in the S&P 500, which effectively means that 6.5% of my investments are in Apple, 5.5% are in Microsoft, 4.7% in Amazon, 2.2% in Facebook, 3% in Google, 1.5% in Berkshire Hathaway, and and so on. So why is this good? Well, it's good for a lot of reasons. So firstly, index funds are really, really easy to invest in. A big problem that beginners have to investing, it's like, well, how the hell do I know which company to invest in? How do I read a balance sheet? How do I do any of this stuff? If you invest in an index fund, you actually don't have to worry about any of that. Secondly, index funds give you a decent amount of diversification. There are all sorts of companies in the S&P 500, so you're not entirely reliant on the tech sector or the oil sector or the clothing sector or anything to make the bulk of your money. You are very nicely diversified across all these US companies. Thirdly, index funds have very low fees. So because it's not a real person who is deciding, what to invest in and doing all this research and trying to make loads of money, it's essentially a computer algorithm that automatically allocates your money, based on the components of the index fund. The fees for those are really low. And one of the main things about investing for the long term is that even a slight increase in your fees is going to massively impact your financial upside. And so, for example, an index fund with a 0.1% fee is so much better for you than an actively managed fund where a fund manager is charging you even 1%, because the long-term difference between 0.1% fees and 1% fees is sort of absolutely astronomical over the long term. And finally, if you look historically, and technically historical performance is not the same thing as future performance, but if you look historically, very few funds have managed to actually consistently beat the market, i.e. outperform the index. And in fact, someone like Warren Buffett famously says that if you gave him £100,000 and asked him to invest it right now, he would just invest in an index fund like the S&P 500. And in fact, in 2008, Warren Buffett challenged the hedge fund industry to try and beat the market. He said that hedge funds are a bit pointless because they charge way too high fees and they don't actually get the sort of returns they claim to get. And so he set up this 10-year bet, which this company called Protégé Partners LLC accepted, where Buffett said that he was going to bet that the index fund outperformed the actively managed fund, and he ended up winning that bet and sort of gave lots of money to charity or something like that. But that just sort of goes to show that it's really hard to beat the market with an actively managed fund. Basically, no one can predict what the market is going to do in the future, and therefore, if you hitch a ride on an index, i.e. you're gambling on the entire market, rather than thinking, you know what, I've got some kind of amazing insight that I'll know exactly which 10 stocks to pick that are going to beat the market, you might as well hitch a ride with the whole market rather than individual stocks. Okay, so we've sorted out the problem of which stocks to invest in by completely circumventing the problem and instead just investing in index funds. The next big question people usually have about investing in stocks and shares is the amount of risk. And that brings us to point number 9. And the argument usually goes as follows, that, hey, okay, cool, this investing in stocks and shares stuff sounds kind of interesting, but my uncle Tom Cobley invested lots of money in the stock market and he lost a load of money, and my parents have told me that investing in the stock market is a really risky thing and I shouldn't do it, and I should instead invest in real estate because real estate is safe. That is usually the sort of thing, the sort of idea that people have about investing in stocks. And naturally, there is the anxiety of what if I lose all my money? So let's talk about that now. So if we take a step back, the only way to lose money in anything is if you buy a thing and then you sell it for less than you actually bought it. Like, let's say you bought a house for £300,000 and then Brexit happens the next day and the house prices plummet and now your house is only worth £250,000. At that point, if you decide to sell your house, then yes, you are losing money and you've lost £50,000. Equally, the only way to really lose money in stocks is if you buy a stock at a certain price and then you sell it for less than that price. So for example, let's say you bought shares in Apple on the 18th of February 2020, and let's say you bought one share, which at the time was $79.75. And because this is your first time investing, you keep on looking at the price of the Apple stock because every day you're thinking, ooh, have I made money? Have I made money? And really annoyingly for you, you see that over the next kind of few days, few weeks, Apple stock is actually going down. And then on the 18th of March 2020, you decide, screw it, I'm going to sell my one share in Apple because I don't want to lose all my money. And you sell it for a measly price of $61.67, and so you've technically lost $18 because you bought it at $79 in February and you sold it for $61 in March. Then you think, damn, I've lost 20% of my investment. This stock market thing is BS. I'm never going to invest in the stock market again, and you call it a day. And this would be a very bad thing to do because, for example, if we look at Apple's stock price in March, it was $57.31. But if you just held on to your one Apple share, in that time, what is it today? It's the 8th of October. Apple is now trading at $114.96. So if you just held on for a few months, you would have actually made a lot of money. You would have bought it at $79, and within, 8 months, it would now be worth $115. That's a pretty good gain. And so the real lesson here is that when you're investing in stocks and shares, and also when you're investing in real estate, these are long-term investments. Ideally, you shouldn't be putting any money into stocks and shares that you need to access within the next 5 years. And actually, a lot of people would extend that to 10 years. And it's exactly like that with house prices. It's like if you buy a house as an investment, and then the house prices go down. It would be completely stupid of you to sell the house unless you are absolutely desperate for the money because something major has happened. And instead, if you just held onto the house, then you would have made more money in the long run, because in the long term, house prices always go up. And in the long term,